Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, February 24th, which you just reminded me right before we started this, is the 3-year anniversary of the Ukraine war or the SMO or when Russia invaded Ukraine. So maybe you can, good time to kind of recap these 3 years and tell us what just your thoughts are.
Well, yeah, I'll do a brief recap. I'm not going to go over the whole 3 years, but I'll go back to that day 3 years ago. It was a shock to me and to a lot of people. Yeah, the first question which you brought up, what do we call it? The SMO, an invasion, or as Mark Sloboda says, an intervention in a civil war. And I honestly think that all three are legitimate ways to describe it. I guess the problem with just using the word invasion is that you deprive it of context. There was a civil war going on beforehand. There was this coup and an obvious intervention by the Western powers back in 2014. So just an invasion gives you the idea that this is something that came out of the blue, and clearly it didn't. So that's why, Mark Swoboda will say an intervention in a civil war. There was ongoing conflict. There was, constant shelling of Donetsk city, for example. I think just probably the best way to call it is the SMO, the special military, the launch of the SMO, the special military operation. And some people also think that don't like that. It seems to describe it as something less than an invasion or a war, but it was. That's the thing. Yeah, let's go back to some of the other words that have been used to describe this. I remember in the first year or so, it's amazing the uniformity of the mainstream media. Like in every single article or report on the war, this particular wording was used. An unprovoked, unjustified invasion. And it was used again and again and again. I can actually, on the question of unjustified, I think that's whether it was justified or unjustified, that's people of goodwill and understanding can disagree on that. But as for the unprovoked, that's just false. It was just utterly false. And anybody knows it was provoked again and again and again. And the reason this war started was because of many, many provocations on the NATO side. And, I don't think we need to go through that. I think anybody who's been following it, our channel will know about, those provocations. So for a whole year, it was unprovoked, unjustified invasion. And then somewhere it switched over to full-scale invasion. So that's what you hear. It's just almost, they never just say invasion. It's always a full-scale invasion. Again, it doesn't matter what newspaper or what news outlet we're talking about. That's what they say. But it wasn't a full-scale invasion. That, again, is just false. The Russians went in with 100,000 of their own soldiers and about 50,000 Donbass militia soldiers. So we are talking about, according to the definition that the mainstream media uses, that there are 50,000 Ukrainians and 100,000 Russians. But this is woefully inadequate for an attempt to take Kiev or, certainly all of Ukraine. It was clear that it was not an attempt to, again, take Kiev or any substantial territory beyond Kiev. Because you simply cannot do that with 150,000 soldiers. Probably a 1 million-man army would have been needed to do something like that. So I think it is fair to say this was a special military operation. And I remember being confused, and I think many of us, what's going on? What are the Russians doing? And it was really over time that we learned that actually the revelations came from people that were involved in the negotiations for the what we call now the Istanbul Agreement or the Istanbul Communique. There was Naftali Bennett, who was the former prime minister of Israel. There were Turks, Turkish officials that were involved in these negotiations. There was a high-ranking German general that was actually was a senior officer, was once a senior officer in NATO, and they all verify. And later, the Ukrainians themselves did. People who were involved in the negotiations. He just kept on piling up. I had heard something about these negotiations, but it wasn't really clear. And it was on. I think it was the very first day of the SMO that Putin called Zelensky and said that we need to talk. Let's negotiate. Let's put an end to this war. And again, they first started negotiating in Belarus, but then they went down to Istanbul. In Istanbul, they reached a draft agreement, which was really very generous to the Ukrainian side. It would, especially where we look where we are today, it would have been a great deal for them. The Russians would withdraw, I think, everything except for the Donbass, because the Donbass had been declared as independent republics at that time. And then, of course, the neutrality for Ukraine, all those things that are very, very important to Ukraine. But Ukraine actually initialed it. Now, there's some question about whether they were ever sincere. And there was fears on the Russian side that were probably pretty well justified, that the Russians were being played by the Ukrainians. And then it appeared to be so. I mean, the Ukrainians gave the signals that, well, we don't really know exactly, what the Ukrainian intentions were. But they did sign it. They went that far. They negotiated. And then as a goodwill gesture, the Russians withdrew from Kiev and other parts of northern Ukraine. And then immediately thereafter, well, we know the story. Boris Johnson called Zelensky, and the Americans pressured Zelensky too, and he tore up the agreement. Anyway, I bring all that up is just because, why do we call it the SMO, the Special Military Operation? It was a military operation that had a definite but limited objective. It was not to seize vast swaths of territory of Ukraine. It wasn't there the purpose was not to overthrow the government or seize Kiev, any of those things. It was to bring them to the negotiating table. And initially, it seemed to succeed, but in the end, it failed. So now we have this war of attrition that's going on, but we still use the SMO to describe it. It still isn't what you would call a full-scale war, I guess. Russia, the Russian economy, Russian society is not on a war footing. There isn't a general mobilization, anything like that. The people that are signing up to serve as soldiers in the army are doing so voluntarily, and they're being generously compensated. These are volunteers. These are, but the average Russian, I can say this for a fact again because your sister has been there for nearly 5 years. Just has not been affected by this in any significant way. And if you go to a place like Moscow, you actually have to look for, well, you don't have to look that hard. You'll see the occasional billboard. I remember seeing a Z on the side of one building. But in general, you don't see any signs, anything to remind you that a war is going on. Society continues as it did before, and in fact, over these last couple of years, has prospered. So I think that just calling it the SMO is still the appropriate term. I think that's the easiest.
Well, it depends, where you're looking at. It's not a full-scale war for the Russians, but it's definitely a full-scale war for the Ukrainians. I mean,
yeah,
they've gone through all these mobilizations and the press gangs. They're definitely not a volunteer fighting force, and society is incredibly affected in Ukraine. It's a
very true
night and day contrast between the two. So, yeah, I feel. I don't know what to describe. We call the Russian side the SMO, but it is a full-blown war within Ukraine, right?
Yeah, from their side, there's no question about it.
Yeah. So should I just say we'll just call it the Ukraine-Russia war? We don't have to get the semantics.
But when we're talking about certainly the outbreak of the current, let's say the escalation that occurred on February 24th, 3 years ago, I think is appropriate to call it the launch of the SMO. It was not a full-scale invasion.
Right. Has Zelensky ever acknowledged the Istanbul agreement? Has he since it's happened?
Right. Let's see. I think he... Did he ever acknowledge it? That's a good question.
Because I know there were some
Yeah.
Ukrainian officials. I
Yeah.
saw
Oh,
the
yeah.
video.
Right.
Yeah,
Very
so
high-ranking officials have acknowledged it. He may have, and if he did, he's certain, like in his usual fashion, he would give it a certain spin, and lie about one aspect of it. But I actually can't recall him doing so.
okay. Well, is the Ukraine war over? What are we looking at right now?
Well, it's not over. No, I mean there's a lot of people dying still. There's some very intense fighting going on in certain parts of the front, like Kursk and Chasiv Yar, and not just there. The fighting continues. And yeah, there is a possibility that it could come to some sort of fairly rapid close. If, for example, the U.S. really does cut off the arms flow to Ukraine, they just are not going to be able to last very long. We'll see a total collapse, I think, within a relatively short period of time. I mean, even if the Europeans continue to supply them with arms, that's less than half, substantially less than half of if that does happen, it'll be substantially less than half of what they're getting now. And even, as things are now, they're retreating in many places, are being forced back in many places along the front. So if a substantial cut in the arms flow is going to just lead to a total collapse. It may not be immediate, but I would think, at the most in 2 months, we would start to see, a significant acceleration in Russian advances, a very significant Russian
Are you sure about that? Because we've talked about just the ineffectiveness of the equipment that we've given them. In general, what is it that the U.S. is providing that's keeping them necessarily in the fight? Because my understanding, a lot of it is the drones, but the drones are actually Ukrainian produced. So there are things that you hear about, like Starlink, like that's used to operate these drones. If the U.S. does pull that, if Elon Musk, who's been very vocal about ending this Ukraine war along with Trump, they have that lever to pull. I think that could end the war quickly.
That may end it faster, it's true. It's like, I know it's a new kind of war, and drones play a very, very important role in this new war. There's no question about it. But armored personnel carriers and all that, it does, it is, those are significant and necessary equipment. But I think, your focus on the drones is warranted. That's when you hear about firsthand accounts of what's going on the front line. That's what the Russian soldiers fear the most. That's what causes them to proceed, incrementally, relatively slowly. Of course, they're going much faster than they did a year ago, but still, they have to be careful. You get out there, and you just never know when one of these will swoop down on you. It's really a kind of like a horror movie. I was just looking at a video last night of some Russian soldiers. They went out and they rescued some of their comrades. They ran back into this building, but then they could see these drones hovering. They had spotted them and were coming. And these drones can fly into buildings. That's the thing. They were just like these. I almost thought of like the age of the dinosaurs, and they're pterodactyls. Or these super raptors up in the sky they can very easily kill you, kill or maim you. And they swoop down. So you could see them, it was clear that these drones had spotted them and were approaching. And this guy was firing from a window, and he took out one and then took out another. But you can imagine the tension. It's very much like a horror movie. I think the drones may, in fact, be the most important part of the Ukraine arsenal, and that's something that they more or less assemble on their own in small workshops, often underground, dispersed across the country. So they're very hard to target, to locate and target. Now they are being outproduced in drones, significantly outproduced by the Russians now, but they're still there, and they're still a problem. There's I just give you an example of what the Russians have had to do to counter the drones. So a lot of things are, there's high tech measures that they use and can use very effectively. Jamming, their electronic warfare is very effective, but uh, it's not absolute. I mean, there are, especially right there at the where combat is taking place. It's hard to move some of that equipment. Um, you want to have sort of be operating under a bubble, ideally, an electronic bubble, to protect you from these drones. But that's not easy to do, and sometimes the men on the front line get ahead of that bubble, and they become vulnerable. So but they've been very creative. Often these units on their own will come up with solutions. I remember it was probably about a year ago or more that we started seeing those kind of big turtle tanks, or they look like rolling metal sheds, and they're very low tech. These guys just welded on some corrugated iron or something, but they're actually pretty effective. They really do protect the tank, from drones. And I think now, like the new tanks that are coming out have a let's say a more professional looking canopy, or I guess they call them what cope nets or cope cages that they put on top of the tank. But then we also, another way to deal with them um, is to avoid actually traveling in a vehicle, together in a vehicle, and instead, we're seeing assaults that are conducted on motorcycles, small motorcycles. So you have maybe a dozen guys on a dozen motorcycles, and that again makes it much more difficult for the drone. They're traveling at a high speed, and you can't get all 12 go after all 12 at once. You have to go after them individually, and so that's been an effective way to deal with it. It's still got to be pretty scary, I imagine.
Right.
You certainly don't want to take a spill while you're on one of those motorcycles out on the field there. Um, and then another thing they did, I think this was right outside of Chasiv Yar, is that they actually enclosed an entire road in netting, so that their cars, their vehicles rather, can go up and down the road and while being protected from drone attacks. So even though the Ukrainians don't have nearly the number of drones that the Russians do, they still have them in sufficient number to create serious problems. And I think you're
Right.
right. That's, it, you know, I, but you don't want to entirely, discount the importance of some of these other things. Certainly, um, howitzers and artillery is playing a very important role in this war. Maybe not as important as the drones, but it's important. A lot of the casualties, or maybe even the majority of the casualties, are by artillery. And so, yeah, if they're already outgunned in that department as well. But if there is a further decrease in both guns and in shells, then they're in serious trouble. But the drones are still there. They're still in the class. So it may be the thing that really would end the war swiftly would be denial of Starlink. And there were rumors to that effect recently. There was even a report in Reuters saying that it was going to, like, March 1st, they would be cut off. But Elon Musk went online and went on X and said, no, I'm not doing that. This isn't a bunch of nonsense. Now, you kind of wondered, because those rumors were rather persistent and coming out of some, very major news outlets. So who knows, maybe the Trump administration started those rumors. They just did put the fear of God in the Ukrainians, to ramp up the pressure and just remind them, hey, we do have this leverage. We can cut this off if you really piss us off.
Right. Yeah, I just feel like observing this war over the past 3 years, the Ukrainian attempt to kind of conduct a more conventional war with the Russians has been just an utter failure.
Yeah.
With the offensive, it was just a bunch of these old farts in the Pentagon that are just like thinking about World War II.
Yeah.
And they just like, we just get them a bunch of Bradleys and a bunch of Abrams tanks, some Leopards, and then we'll just steamroll right through these defenses. It was silly.
It was a total disaster.
Work. A total disaster.
Right.
And so I feel like that conventional warfare style that the U.S. was backing and supporting and providing tactical support strategy as well was really damaging to the Ukrainian military operations. And so I almost feel like that's why I'm saying that the amount of money that we sent and the amount of equipment we sent, I don't know if it really helped the Ukrainians. It almost gave them this illusion that they were more powerful than they really were, and it was very damaging to their cause. And this is just weird to me as well, that we have Russia and the U.S. talking about ending this war, but Ukraine and Europe aren't involved in it. So if Ukraine doesn't want to go on, if they adopt more of a guerrilla warfare tactic instead of rolling around in their tanks, it could be more effective and just bog things down. And we've seen, there was even an acknowledgement within the U.S. with Victoria Nuland kind of saying that we got to go to asymmetrical warfare, which in my mind is kind of it's a nice way of saying terrorism.
Yeah. Well, we've seen it. We've seen a number of terroristic attacks, and
right. So that's
but that's militarily ineffective. I think it just gives those people emotional satisfaction. We killed some Russians, but it doesn't.
Right,
you're right.
But I think I'm just worried that we will come to this agreement between Russia and the U.S. will pull out. Of course, it'll be I think the biggest thing that might end that war actually is just if the flow of money stops going to Ukraine, because I think the support for what's happening in Ukraine is largely there because of the money that we're pumping in to support it. You get a lot of paid foot soldiers, a lot of paid, propaganda. The U.S. aid thing, I think, was a huge hit to destroy the narrative. So I believe that's really damaging. But if the EU doubles down and continues to commit, will keep on pumping money into Ukraine, then you're funneling a kind of a guerrilla resistance, terrorist type of activity that could be very difficult to extinguish. If they're sure they're not using ATACMS missiles or their Abrams tanks or their howitzers, but they have their drones that are terrifying. They're sending a lot of money into Kiev to prop up the regime, to continue the fight against the Russians, basically fueling insurgencies we could see, which I think could be very difficult to.
Well, we haven't seen that, and I think the reason is first that the Russians have been proceeding relatively slowly, again faster than in the past, but slowly, and then the territory that they're taking is very Russia friendly. So we're not seeing insurgencies, and I don't think we will unless they go beyond. They go maybe to Kiev, or certainly if they go into Western Ukraine, they're going to have to deal with insurgencies, and that could be really ugly. I really don't think they want to do that. They may find that they're just forced to, but I think that it's not really the Russian objective now. But
then just Western Ukraine is just going to be a hotbed of anti-Russian hatred, where they'll use it and that will be propped up with potentially EU money to keep this going, to continue these little attacks, which means that Russia will be compelled to continue moving forward. They can't have this constant.
That's right. That's the problem.
So, I don't know. Maybe it won't end soon. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah. I'm not as optimistic as a lot of people think, but I think there's no question that there will be. I understand. You're right. You're right to point out the importance of drones, and I don't think the supply of drones is going to be affected by any weapons cut off, because that's something that they are producing locally. They're getting components, from various sources, but I think they'll continue to get those components. But there will be a definite acceleration. It's not like these other things just don't matter. One thing that does matter, as we can see, is air defense. And that's something that's being supplied to them by both the Americans and the Europeans. The IRIS-T is one of the main air defense systems that the Europeans have been supplying. Then we have, the Patriots. But they're in low supply. They're not that great. I think they really are outmatched by their Russian equivalents. but they still matter. They do, and the Russians have to exercise caution. Again, it's just like this has been a revolution in air warfare. It used to be that the fighter jets were kings of the skies, and it's just not true now. They could even fly over places that had fairly effective air defense, and if fired upon, they could, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, they could evade those missiles. That's just not true anymore. So they have to stay back. They have to exercise a great deal of caution, and it does limit what they can do. Now, they can still do a great deal of damage with these glide bombs. They can stand back, even 50 kilometers and launch one of these. But they would be much more effective if they could come, fly directly over the targets. They would be able to conduct many, many more missions and deliver, just many more bombs. So that's just one example. And then, I mentioned the artillery. So it's not like it's just drones. Okay. Some of that equipment is definitely useful. I think a lot of it's overrated, like the tanks, and maybe even, well, I think you would rather be traveling in an armored personnel carrier than in a civilian vehicle. There's at least a chance that you're going to survive a strike, when you're in an APC, but there's just no chance when you're in a civilian vehicle. So it still does make a difference. And if all that kind of military equipment was cut off, it would significantly weaken them. And I think you would see, a very obvious acceleration in the Russian advance. Yeah, but if you get into insurgency, that's something altogether different. And I think the Russians really want to avoid that. But as you pointed out, you have the problem. You have this virulently anti-Russian state, supported by the West, at least by the Europeans. That would be just a constant thorn in the side of Russia. And they might feel like they just have to, even though they don't want to, just have to go in and clean things up.
Right. I mean, this is what's so strange is that we have the U.S. and Russia having this meeting, and it's fantastic to repair relations. But the EU is still, and Ukraine seem like they don't want this peace. They don't want it. And I mean, I don't know if you saw this quote from the Danish Prime Minister. She said, peace in Ukraine may be more dangerous than ongoing war. And if this echoes the sentiment of Brussels, of the EU,
I think it does.
Then we have a real problem. Yeah. Because if the European elite establishment does not want to make peace, they will always be able to fund, the far right anti-Russian nationalists in Western Ukraine to continue attacks on Russia, whether it be an increasing number of terrorist attacks or to continue with this support of to fund these press gangs, to send people to the front line, and maybe they'll kind of divert their tactics to camping out in the woods and sending out drones here and there. It could be a very difficult situation for the Russians.
Okay, I think in the end the Russians are going to win no matter what, and it's just sort of a question of how long it'll take and what you define. I think John Mearsheimer is correct. The Russians will attain victory, but it will be an ugly victory. I mean, it's not, and they just may decide, okay, this is not ideal. This is not what we really want, but I think it's good enough. One thing is like if you have Odessa and Kharkov, especially Odessa, that deprives the Ukrainians access to the Black Sea. And it does fundamentally weaken them as a state and as a threat, because that's one of the threats is actually in the Black Sea, and where the Ukrainians have been relatively successful using their naval drones, the water surface drones, and I think in some cases they may have actually used underwater drones. But if you can deprive them of that access, you do fundamentally weaken them, and that may be sufficient. But just in the long run too, they can start mobilizing younger men, 18 to 25-year-olds, but eventually they're going to run out of those men too. And in fact, what I've heard is that like in high schools in Ukraine, a lot of the classes are almost completely devoid of men, of male students. because families are getting their 16 and 17-year-olds just out of the country. They don't want to see, they don't want to see their son, turn 18 and then be nabbed. So they're just getting them out of the country. And I'm sure a lot of those in the 18 to 25 categories are, among those who've been swimming across the rivers and climbing, crossing the mountains, doing whatever they can. In the end, I don't know how many they're going to get. Yet even if they get a significant number, eventually they're going to burn through those too. I mean, a lot of, very sadly, a very large percentage will be killed or maimed, and so they can't go on forever, even if they use increasingly smart tactics. So far they have not done that, but maybe if Zelensky goes, that's a lot of us are hoping to see him go, but it actually may be to Ukraine's benefit, especially to the benefit of their military effort if Zelensky goes, because he has been just a total moron when it comes to leading their military operations. Look at Kursk. Look again and again. He's demanded that they hold their ground, just not retreat an inch. And we've seen disaster after disaster. So eventually it's just clear that let's say a town is going to fall, and but they refuse. The soldiers in that town will say, "We've got to go. We can't hold this any longer. We just can't," and they're just told to stay. And then it's just too late. They're completely encircled, and finally, the order comes, retreat, but it's too late. So the vast majority of them die. Maybe they die right there within the town, or die trying to escape. Across the fields that are just completely under the fire control of the Russians. So again, Zelensky has been a moron, and you get rid of him, you get somebody like Zelensky in there. Not that he's a genius, but he's shown that he's more realistic. And so, yeah, he may start to adopt some of the tactics that you were describing, and it will help them. It'll allow them to fight longer. But in the end, even with that, they're going to lose. And if the Russians are intent on, taking those territories, like, certainly the four oblasts, but if they keep on fighting, they're not going to stop at the four oblasts. It's going to also be Kharkov and Nikolaev and Odessa.
I'm just afraid it's just going to be this long festering wound that won't heal. I was getting a little...
No, I think you're right to fear that.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of getting excited, once the talks in Riyadh and when Trump made the phone call to Putin, I'm like, it's over, it's done. But then I'm not so sure anymore because of the response from the Europeans. I was hoping that the Europeans, my initial thought was like, they'd be like, oh, thank goodness, this war's over. It's been so bad for us. But instead, it's been the complete opposite. And it sounds like their goal right now is to sabotage the peace deal. And would you agree? Is that what their objective is right now? The EU are they trying to sabotage any chance of peace?
They clearly don't want a peace deal to be made between the U.S. and Russia. They clearly I mean, you've seen magazine covers like The Economist, like Europe's nightmare, and it shows Putin talking to Trump. This is the way they look at it. So yeah, they'll do whatever they can to prevent it. There's no question about it.
Well, why don't they want a peace deal? Why isn't peace good? Why would the Danish PM saying that the peace would be more dangerous than the ongoing war?
Well, I think she seems to honestly believe that that Putin is the current incarnation of Hitler, and then he's just going to keep on marching west. And I think some of them do. I mean, I think maybe quite a few of them do. They've again, we've talked about this many times before. I think they've become victims of their own narrative. It's a narrative that was, of course, that in good part it came out of the U.S. and the previous administration, and not just them. It goes back decades, of course. But they have so demonized the Russians and they've come to really believe their own words. They can't talk peace. It's just like the only thing, if we don't destroy this monster's going to destroy us.
It almost feels to me that we are seeing almost like the Russia and the United States on one side in a camp versus Ukraine and Europe in a way. I mean, if we look at least in terms of this peace deal, but
right.
the way that Europe is responding, this idea that we have to form, and they feel very betrayed by the United States right now, and they feel like we have to carve our own path, independent path, which is great. Europe, you should carve your own path. I agree,
Right.
but but their path is to continue the war,
Right.
is what
Yeah.
they're choosing, which is just insane. Instead of taking care of their own countries and trying to formulate their own mutually beneficial relationship with Russia and Ukraine and everybody, So is that almost kind of what you're seeing, that Russia and the United States are we shouldn't say butting up exactly.
Yeah, we're a long ways from that. Yeah.
But they're forming this kind of more of this block, and they're actively they're being thwarted by the EU, the European nations, and Ukraine. So you're kind of pushing them together. You're pushing Russia and the U.S. together more and more by the reaction of Europe. If Europe was, if Europe adopted the the position on the side of the U.S. saying like, yes, we want to make sure we want to get a peace deal, but we want to make sure that Ukraine gets the best deal possible. But we're going to sit here and work with you on negotiating on that. Then I think you would see more of a solidified EU-US bloc. The relationship would be maintained against Russia. But now I almost feel like Russia and the US are like, okay, these guys are crazy. Let's just,
Right. Yeah. Well, of course, the Europeans are thinking that the Americans are crazy too. In this case, I agree with the Americans, the current administration. The Europeans are crazy. One thing is, several people have pointed out, is that the Europeans basically have, let's say, outsourced diplomacy and strategic thinking to the Americans ever since the creation of NATO, which after World War II, and it's at least if I don't know 30 years ago or whatever, there were real European statesmen who had visions, who that weren't entirely dictated by the U.S. But it seems like over this time in general, that ability to think strategically, to do diplomacy, it's just atrophied in Europe. So it's just like these guys don't seem to have any idea of what they're supposed to do, and all they can do is repeat, what they said earlier. There's just a total lack of imagination. And an inability to recognize errors and to chart a new course. It's just like more of the same. That's what they're doing. I think it was just the other day that the UK declared that they were going to impose yet another sanctions package. They're pass another one and impose yet another set of sanctions on Russia. And I'm sure Russia is quaking in its boots right now. It's just a total lack of imagination. I think the greatest hope, of course, the best thing is, like, you said, is that a real settlement could be negotiated and the Ukrainians, the Europeans could accept it. That would be best for Russia. It would be best for Ukraine. It would be best for everybody. And I think the Russians would, like, for example, if they did accept what Putin offered, the four oblasts, neutrality, denazification, if they actually accepted it, the war could stop and the territorial losses would be relatively small on the part of Ukraine. They would still have access to the Black Sea. They could, be a viable nation. And in fact, they would be a more united nation. It was a divided nation before, which is why we had the Civil War. A very, very substantial portion of the population was basically Russian. And now I say, okay, you were interested in being Ukrainian. If you can at least, drop the real vicious anti-Russian part of your ideology, and that would have to be part of a settlement. It's like, no persecution of Russian speakers or Hungarians or some of the other ethnic groups within Ukraine. If you can drop that, you could have your Ukrainian country, and it could prosper. And as a neutral country, it could become a very important, kind of link between the West and the East. And, there are all these things. You could look at it that way. But unfortunately, we don't see any signs of that. Certainly not with the current governments in Europe or, the current regime in Ukraine. Now, maybe we can hope right now it doesn't seem very likely for real revolutions or quasi revolutions in Europe. A victory for a truly dissident party that does want to reorient its policy the way that apparently anyway at this point the Trump administration is doing. And a revolution of some kind in Ukraine, where you say, okay, look, this failed. This was a total disaster. We're going to have to really talk peace here. But right now, you just don't see it. You see it like on the horizon, I think, in Europe, that revolution really could take place. A revolution in thinking and in policy. It's probably years away. Which may be too long. I don't know. You don't see it in Ukraine, but Ukraine itself is under such stress that maybe what seems like such a solid anti-Russian bloc there could just fall apart because the reality is so overwhelming. The loss is hard to deny, and they just maybe there will be some brave individual or faction or whatever who will turn things around in Ukraine. I don't see it now, but we can just hope.
What do you think is going to be the future of European-U.S. relations now?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's hard to say. Again, it's just partly because the European leaders are just not responding rationally. Like I say, they're just simply repeating what they've always said before. It's like our leader is gone, but remember what our leader before told us, and we will just keep on doing that, right? But it's not going to work. So what's going to happen? Will these populist parties, rise to power and just clean out house? That's a possibility. Or will there be just some kind of reckoning within some self-awareness, let's say, and an awakening, I guess is what I really wanted to say, among the elite in Europe? I honestly think these people are just incapable of that. And it's going to have to be, it's entirely new political parties that are going to have to come into power and change things. Right now, I was thinking, just looking, we've talked about the split within the U.S. between blue and red. You can almost say that in a way it's kind of spread all the way to Europe. So we're talking about a blue-red split where Europe, with some exceptions, is basically blue, and the U.S. is red in its foreign policy approach. And that's quite an extraordinary thing. But I think it is a fundamental ideological division. In fact, I think it was the former, the title they give these guys is like 20 words long, but he was basically the foreign minister of the EU, Joseph Borrell. He said that very recently said that there was a deep and ideological division between Europe and the United States. We've talked about that division within our own country, but now we're seeing it between the two. Now, of course, this is not over. Like we said, the Democrats actually could come back and the U.S. could become blue again, and then maybe parts of Europe will become red. This is going to be sort of an ideological civil war that we're watching here, and who knows how it's going to end.
Yeah, I mean, we saw the German elections just happened, and it looks like Merz will become chancellor.
Yeah, as expected.
Right. So that's basically means that we're going to have the same old within Germany, right?
Yeah.
Shouldn't expect any change, or very little. I mean, Merz was somebody that was just 5-6 months ago talking about sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine to fire into Russia.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean,
if anything, he was more of a hawk than Schultz and the previous coalition. So we may even see some ramping up. But the thing is, like, what can Germany do? It's all hot air. That's the thing. These guys talk tough, but they don't really have armies to back them up. They don't have the military capacity. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. He could give Taurus missiles, and that would be a very serious escalation because, again, they have a much longer range than the ATACMS, for example, 500 kilometers versus 300 kilometers. So Taurus missiles could strike virtually every anywhere in Moscow. Um, so yeah, it could that is something to worry about. I think like the best thing that we have seen, at least so far. Yeah, I mean, there's not going to be a negotiated settlement. I think it's highly doubtful. Um, the war will continue. It'll be ugly for a while. It'll have an ugly ending. That's probably what we're going to see. But at least with the current administration, we're not seeing the threat of escalation that we saw under Biden. It seemed like he was always on this path of escalation. And in the end, of course, he lifted the restrictions on missiles going into pre-2014 Russian territory. That was a clear and very dangerous escalation. Again, here we are more than a month since Trump took office, and there hasn't been one confirmed attack on Russia, and that's good. So maybe at least this is going to be an ugly war, but if we're off the path to escalation, we can breathe a sigh of relief. This is a tragedy for Ukraine, especially, and it is a burden. Many Russian soldiers have been killed and more will be. But we're not going to see World War III. Or it seems to me much less likely under the current administration, unless there is some sort of about face. But it doesn't seem, it looks like they're really committing to a different approach and to de-escalation.
Do you think that Europe could try to escalate on its own?
Well, that's possible, but I think it's unlikely.
Try to invoke Article 5. They take the Zelensky path. Let's start doing Hail Marys.
Well, and also do something, create an incident where the Americans feel obligated to move in. Obviously Zelensky's been trying to do that. And one of the plans that have been floated recently by the French and the British is to send their troops into Ukraine. They're calling them peacekeeping troops, or some other euphemism. And now, if they come under attack, maybe or maybe even using. I think I know the British have been talking about using their fighters to patrol the skies of Western Ukraine. Now, the Russians have made that clear that's unacceptable. And if they're being launched from bases in Poland, which is where they probably would be taking off from, the Russians have made clear that those bases would be legitimate targets of Russian attacks. So let's say they do something like that. They push it. It's really a deliberate provocation. The Russians strike one of these bases, and then the pressure is on for the U.S. to do something. There will be an attempt, at least, to invoke Article 5 and bring in all NATO, including the U.S. Now, that's not impossible, but it seems like the current administration is wise to those sort of things right now and does not want to become involved, and it will make it crystal clear. So far, they have said, on more than one occasion, we're not getting involved. We're not sending our own troops here. Understand that we're not, and if you go in there as peacekeeping troops, we're not backing you up. I think they need to say that again and again and again. So far it's encouraging. So it seems highly unlikely. Even if they do, try some sort of subterfuge like that.
Do you think that NATO will fall apart? And then under this Trump administration, that Trump may try to withdraw from NATO? I mean, just the way that things are going right now?
It's not impossible. I'll never say anything is impossible when it comes to Trump. You just don't know. And he clearly has no fondness for NATO. Going back to his 2016 campaign, he said on more than one occasion that he thought that NATO didn't really serve any purpose now, and that it should be ended, and the U.S. should withdraw from it. And that, that's had the alarm bells ringing. Now, when he came into office, he ended up actually strengthening NATO and expanding it, and but that was clearly a very different term. Now, when we come to the end of this term, maybe we'll look back and we'll say, we were so foolish to get excited. It all ended up the same. That maybe is where we'll be. But I think this term is beginning so differently, and Trump clearly has control over both the Republican Party and over his own administration that he did not have in the first term. He was really a victim in a way of his own party and his own administration. But this time it looks like he has his hands firmly on the reins. He has people who either agree with him or just willing to, to implement his ideas, whether or not they believe in them. He has loyal servants, loyal foot soldiers.
So what do you expect? What do you expect to come out of this talk in Riyadh with Trump and Putin? He said something that we could expect something this week, right? Or within a week.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. You hear different things. The Russians seem to are talking about a slower process. I think it's more likely it'll be sometime next month that they'll have a summit meeting. I think right now, they're still trying to lay the groundwork for it. There was the initial meeting last week in Riyadh, which I think it sounds like it really was positive. And from that it's clear that at least, again, we're going to restaff the embassies, start to normalize diplomatic relations. And for that, we should all be very, very thankful. And yeah, they agreed that their respective leaders should talk. But the Russians have said that we do need to prepare for this. Just having a talk for a talk's sake is kind of a waste of time. We need to lay the groundwork, figure out those areas where our two leaders can make some real progress, do some of the preparatory work, and then we'll have the meeting. So I think, who knows, but I think it'll be at least a couple more weeks.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering if it's even possible for Russia and the U.S. to do a negotiated settlement without involving Europe or Ukraine.
Yeah.
We have this agreement, but that's kind of what we were talking about in the beginning. If the EU and the Ukraine want to keep this war going, they can.
Right.
It's dumb, but it's just going to be a lot more death.
Exactly. They do have to agree to it. I think this is the right way to go about it. If you had them at the table right now, you would get nowhere.
Right.
Okay, and so
I agree.
I think both sides understand that. It's actually very encouraging that the Americans seem to understand that, and we just got to keep the Europeans and the Ukrainians at the kids' table, as some people have described it. While we the grown-ups are the adults' table, and in the end they could work out a deal. But if it's not accepted, well, the thing is, let's say they work out a deal. Maybe very much along the lines of what Putin proposed back in June of last year. And then they go back and they tell the Europeans and the Ukrainians, this is what we want to do. And if the Ukrainians in particular, the Europeans could reject it outright. And there's not a whole lot that the U.S. could do about it. But if the Ukrainians reject it, we've seen what the U.S. could do. If it stops the funding and the flow of weapons and cuts off Starlink, then it's really all over for Ukraine. And the U.S. has that power. If they decide that they're really going to use it and they make it clear to the Ukrainians, hey, this is the way it's going to be. If you don't go along with this, we're out of here. And we're really out of here. Not just that we're going to slow down arms flows. We're cutting them off and Elon Musk is going to switch off the Starlink. They just may not have a choice. But I don't know if we're going to go that far. We'll see.
Yeah. It just.
I don't think so. I just hope so. That's
right. It's just crazy to me that we have a war in Europe, and the Europeans are not involved, and it's their own doing. It's proof of how neutered the Europeans have become.
Right.
Like you said, they outsource everything to the United States. So now the U.S. is the one that's just going to make the shots, and they're just sitting on the sidelines. And I'm sure they have to be so enraged, such a slap in their face. So I'm just worried that they now view America as the enemy in a way.
Some of them clearly do. Just like they're, certainly the Trump administration as the enemy, just as there are many people in this country that view him as an enemy, a greater threat to America than a foreign leader, a foreign adversary. I think that's quite true. I was just talking about that, that deep and ideological divide that Joseph Borrell referred to. It's real. They're on the U.S., at least the administration, the current administration is on the other side of the divide from most of Europe.
Yeah, the whole dynamic is just switched. I just see the relationship.
Right.
Yeah.
It's true. I think it can't be overemphasized actually how extraordinary this is. Like I was saying beforehand, look, I've heard again and again all these promises from candidates going back decades and decades, and when it comes to foreign policy, nothing ever changes, and that's true. And I think it's been true for at least 100 or 125 years. There's just this may be the greatest rupture or change in direction in foreign policy that we've seen in the history of the U.S. So this is something that cannot be overemphasized, that this is an extraordinary turn of events. This is just, I don't think anybody saw it coming. Even the people like you were more hopeful about Trump, but I don't think anybody saw that it was going to go this far, this fast. And we'll see where it all ends up. But even if it kind of ends up in just kind of like a huge train wreck, which is possible. Again, we talked about things that could go wrong, like the tariffs and so forth. And who knows what the deep state is going to devise, probably in concert with the European powers. Even if it does end as a disaster, as a failure, the damage has been done. I think the deep state, the globalist establishment has been severely, if not mortally wounded by this, even what's happened so far.
Right. I don't think it's really sunk in for most people what's actually happened.
Right. It's just so fast.
Right. But you can kind of see it, the recognition within some elites. I mean, for example, you said the organizer of the Munich Security Conference actually broke down in tears. It's like the U.S. just handed divorce papers to the EU out of the blue, and they're just like, they're stunned.
Yeah.
And you hear the talk about, well, we have to form our own path now, independent of the United States.
Yeah.
Like it's just the Europe and America it just felt like that was always just one inseparable block.
That was right.
And now it just all of a sudden it's completely it's been severely damaged, that relationship. And well, I don't know, I think it's a good thing though. I mean, like this ideological war, I mean, if the EU just really is just set on having a war with Russia, leave us out of it, leave America out of it. And I hope they'll come to their senses and be like, no, we can all work together. I just, the idea of, there's always that talk about Trump wanting that Yalta recreation, maybe with Xi Jinping, Putin, and Trump. If that can happen, it's like, why are we against that? These three great powers in the world, if we can all get along, I don't know what we're doing with China. It seems like we're pivoting, trying to play hardball.
Yeah.
I don't know. But just the fact that if we repair this relationship with Russia is such a great thing. We neutralize the threat of World War III. If we can have a good relationship with China, it's just like the whole world should be rooting for that. That's great. That's great for everybody.
I think most of the world is. It's really the West that isn't.
Because
Europe.
Right, because the U.S. was their champion and fighting, was the number one dog, and all of a sudden he's getting in a relationship with the up and coming stars, and they don't like that. They want to just stay hitched to the U.S. being number one, and yeah, it's just a weird time. I think by the time this presidency is over, just everything we thought about the United States and its relationship, its foreign policy, is just going to be we have to rewrite the whole thing. It's all changing.
Yeah, no, it's quite a political earthquake. I mean, it's just, I guess you can't say, well, the scale and the speed of it, I think, is totally unexpected by just about everybody. maybe everybody except for Donald Trump himself.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I mean, what are we at not even 2 months, right? I mean,
Well, it's a little over a month, right?
yeah, just right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's only February 20th. Right. It's,
Well, yeah, not even a month. Not even a month, right?
Well, he came January 20th, so it's a little over a month, but
no, it was no, a little less than a month. It's the February 24th day, right?
right. Well, he's inaugurated on the 20th.
Oh, it was the 20th. Oh, I was just thinking of your mother's birthday. Forgive me. Okay, well, she'll be pleased to hear that.
Okay,
Yeah.
well,
But that
right.
just reminds me, this is kind of a little aside, but I think it's interesting. I just heard from your mother this morning because, she follows the news on Taiwan and China very closely, that there is a huge uproar in Taiwan. It was discovered that there was something called, I think, the Black Bear Academy there. And so it's very innocuous sounding, but they had received some tens of millions of dollars from USAID, basically to intensify hatred and suspicion of China, so and to fight any moves towards reconciliation and closer relations. So that again, even in Taiwan, the USAID's tentacles extended that far.
Yeah, it's not surprising. I know the same thing's happening in India right now with election interference from USAID. Right, they're quite upset. So the whole world, like they said, the mask has fallen. Everything's changing. It's changing so quick. I think people aren't even aware of how just the magnitude of these changes are. It takes a while to sink in and realize that everything is different now.
Right. Yeah, I think, even if it kind of goes back superficially, let's say the Democrats win next term, it's been changed. They really can't put it back together again. I think that's what they're going to find.
Okay, well, maybe we end it there, Dad?
Sure.
Okay. All right, enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.